parts of Baltimore contain so much interesting history, and most of it goes totally unacknowledged. There are still many hidden pockets of history in Baltimore, despite the big museums, historical societies, and blacks and whites and alike. I found that out after speaking to my great grandmother. I always consider her my grandmother rather than my great grandmother, so you'll hear me refer to her as my grandmother. In fact, my actual grandmother, her daughter, passed away when my mother was just a little girl. Anyway, usually my Nanan was pretty hushed about the history. However, the moment she opened up, it was so interesting to unravel the hidden histories in East Baltimore. Not only was her grandmother the last slave of our family and someone my grandmother fondly remembers, but my grandmother also revealed nostalgic moments of her childhood, combing her grandmother's long black hair, climbing fruit trees, and most of all, surviving desegregation and racism. She showed me a graduation picture of, if I remember correctly, her kindergarten class from one of the first desegregated elementary schools in all of Baltimore. This was back during the early 1940s when desegregation and the civil rights movement had barely started. It was a large class of just young white children. With a great big smile, she pointed at the little girl in the front of the line. "That was me," she said, almost as if she was reliving the moment in her mind. Her eyes lit up. We were the first class of black children to go to this elementary, but we were so young we didn't really know how much of an honor that was. This was our graduation. The darker black kids weren't allowed in the picture. Usually we didn't even eat lunch in the same room or even have access to the library or playground. But because of my skin color, I was allowed in the front of the line for this picture day. And she wasn't lying. She practically blended into the picture. You could just barely tell the difference between her and the other white students, and not a single darker child in sight. She went on to explain how much school and presentation was important to her mother. My mother made sure I was looking especially clean that day. My hair was straightened and tied in these little bows, and a nice puffy dress and black shoes with newly shined buckles. I was so pretty that day. But my mother and grandmother always made sure we looked presentable. My grandmother told me to take my learning seriously so that I could be a professional woman. Education was important to her mother too, and we were all educated women, and I taught your grandmother and your mother to be educated too. We were beautiful and educated. If I spoke wrong or even tore my stockings, my grandmother wouldn't hesitate to take a switch to my behind. And she laughed, and I could just tell between her and her cousins, she was probably a little troublemaker. And then she touched on one of the most daring and personal topics, relationships. I knew this was a hushed topic for her, so I didn't ask her any questions. I just listened. We were always supposed to be ladylike, not cutting up around boys or none of that. My grandmother liked me and my cousins to marry someone educated and a black man, no one else, but an educated, professional black man. She went on to describe how she fell in love with my grandmother's father. You could almost hear her voice singing as she mentioned him. Even though she remarried, it's like she could never let go of the moments they stayed together. Some moments, though not a full relationship, last for a lifetime more than any relationship could. And although her promiscuity was rare and a shock at the time, you could tell she had a certain freedom in her intimacy that she neither was afraid to express nor pass down. But as quickly as she touched on the subject, she stopped. She told me that he had to leave to New York for work, and when he left, he got sick and died. After some stories from other relatives, I'm not quite sure the complete accuracy in her narration of it, but I was sure that there was something special, a true love between them. But what revealed itself much more than love behind the scenes of her story was the face of colorism and leftover remnants of the mindset of slavery. In her tale of education, femininity, and a pride on light color and long hair, even of that of her lover, there was still a certain appeasal to a very particular black pride that had effaced itself at that time. Staying and finding pride within the black community while also putting emphasis and even a divide between education and color versus those without. And as I learned more about family history, I started to piece together much more to this puzzle, and I wasn't even fully ready for all that I would soon discover.